For the State Treasurer, Ms. Glasser-Hedrick.
Here.
Mr. Rosensteel.
Here.
Ms. Higa.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Mr. Keeley. Here. And Mr. Unterman is absent. Ms. Vargas. Here. And for the Director of Finance, Ms. Ortega. Here. Chairperson, you have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much.
We didn't lose Ms. Gonzalez. He's somewhere in Sacramento. We do have time.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'll note when he arrives.
All right, very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Good morning. So our first item is, I believe, approval of the, were there changes to the agenda that we needed to note? No agenda changes?
Approval of the agenda and approval of the minutes.
On the minutes, okay, all right.
We're good to go.
I have a motion.
So moved.
Okay, approved by Mr. Rosensteel, second by Ms. Higa, without objection. Such will be the order, okay? And then we'll move on to item number 3. So revisions to the board policy manual. First, let me just thank Jill and Brian for your continued diligence on this work. And Jill, why don't we open up the item?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Jill Lukens, Senior Ethics and Compliance Counsel. So this item is intended to address 4 different policies in the board policy manual. Some of them are technical revisions, and then there's some greater changes to a couple of the policies. I'll just review them. Everything is in the write-up, and then I'll note there's 2 changes that clerical issues in the write-up I'll address too. So the first one is the addition of a policy review provision. I believe the committee had asked that there would be a policy or language in the board policy manual that would reflect a cycle of for revisions to board policy provisions. And so that we added that. The second one is the addition of a delegation of authority review timelines. This is similar in that wanted to add a provision that would set in stone that there is actually a review process for the delegation of authority. On that item, it's Board Gov 8. It should be highlighted in red, the language that states the delegations of authority will be reviewed at least once every 2 years or more often as necessary. That is actually the language that was intended to be added, so that should have been highlighted in red. And then the third one is the election of officers policy. Since the board meeting schedule changed, that we're going to change that from April to May to reflect the current board meeting schedule. So that's just more of a technical revision. And then the fourth one, yeah, I noted that one too. The fourth one is the fiduciary council policy, and this one was intended to revise that policy to clearly reflect that fiduciary counsel is counsel to the board. So that was revised. There's language in red that will be essentially replace the existing policy language, and you can see those changes outlined on Board Gov 8 and 9. One clerical change in the red language on top of Board Gov 9, the sentence that reads, "The fiduciary council will represent and advise the board regarding the nature and scope of its fiduciary duty and the discharge," it should say, "of its system responsibilities." So that's just a clerical change. So those are the proposed revisions, and if there are any questions from the committee, I'm happy to answer those.
Great, thank you, Jill. We do have a question. Dana?
So good morning. Jill, I really like the language that we're going to be adding here, particularly that about reviewing the board policy manual. And not that I want to change what the wording that we're going to put in. I would just like to suggest that instead of taking a look at the whole board policy manual once every 3 years, the whole in its entirety, that we actually chunk that up into sections, and one section gets reviewed 1 year of that 3-year cycle, the next section the second year, and then the third section the third year. So then it's on a rotational basis. So the committee doesn't actually have to do every 3 years a yeoman's job of reviewing the whole manual, but take that in bites and then have that come in a circular fashion. I think that would be make for an easier workload. So I would like to suggest that's how it's actually put into practice. But that's up to the committee. But I think I'm glad that we're adding this into our manual.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, the way the policy is written, it's more broad to put into the policy manual, but we could probably develop some sort of written procedure in that way if we want to categorize the review process so that it's,
And I think for purposes of what we're trying to do as we've been meeting is just to kind of go through the manual in its entirety first. So we've kind of got a baseline and now can really do it on a more of a rotating basis. So, Brian, did you have?
I was just going to add to that thought. So already in your policy manual, every time you change a policy or amend it, it has a new date. And so then that would fall in a cycle, the 3-year cycle. So you already naturally have a separation and a work plan. So the purpose of this policy is really to address those stagnant policies
Right.
that,
Exactly.
and considering the work that you do on all the policies, there aren't too many of those. So, but we do have that in mind. We also recognize not just the workload of the committee, but our workload. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dana. All right, Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate these changes. I have, just my question is about the review of the policies. So is that what would that process be? I mean, I can't imagine that, the multi-100-page document is going to come before the governance committee to review the whole, I mean, what's the process? I mean, what's the process that gets to us? What we as the governance committee would be looking at every 3 years? And maybe it's a question for the chair.
I guess my thought about this is, given that we've done a pretty thorough review of the policy manual to date, and that would kind of be our baseline. Updates would be so noted with the revision date. And I'm not foreseeing a lot coming back to the committee in practice, unless it were, what's going to drive substantive policy changes are certainly things that we have been discussing with pretty serious consideration, either in this committee or in other committees of the board. So, but Amy, maybe you want to weigh in terms of what's the practice generally.
Sure, and I thank you, Madam Chair. The last time that we conducted a real thorough review of the board policy manual was several years back, I believe. 2014, yes. And at that time, what we did is we did take a look at the entire manual, the sections that the committee has authority over, and we brought back to you recommendations, on substantive recommendations on what was substance that needed committee involvement and time, and what were more administrative or formatting changes that staff could go ahead, perhaps with your approval, and just make. So that was the process at the time, and if you remember back to that year of 2014, what that essentially kicked off, we started the routine reports policy where staff collected all the different reports that were coming to you so you could make decisions on formatting and changes and things of that nature for time and frequency, as well as the compensation policy got reviewed, and so that was the result of the process at the time.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Jill and Brian, I have a question on the section relating to fiduciary counsel. And it's really more of an oversight question, and that is, I guess, to understand the role of you, Brian, as general counsel in terms of either directing fiduciary counsel. This has to do with how we monitor costs ultimately in terms of usage of fiduciary counsel. I have no issues with fiduciary counsel and board members having direct interaction, but how do we oversee that from a administrative oversight perspective?
Well, right now, what we do is, I review the bills, but the real oversight is when you review your consultants annually. That's part of the package that you get, are the fees and costs. So you get that annually to take a look at, and in my experience, then consultants get guidance from the board on those kind of costs and utilization. So that's the way it worked. It also is, in practicality, it's a collegial relationship. I mean, it doesn't have to be. Obviously, fiduciary counsel works for the board, but they're professional, and so I review bills, and it's very easy for me to say, let's
Bumping up
talk
against.
about this. And in my experience, especially with this firm, they've been very receptive on that. But at the same time, your costs have gone up. Which I'm not suggesting is anything wrong, but you do utilize fiduciary counsel quite a bit. These are costs that go up on a regular basis. We have fee agreements, and they're set, so that's important. But they do go up, I think maybe 5 or 10%. There's a stepped in, it's in the contract.
Right.
So it really is a utilization review.
Okay.
But I think overall, the annual review is actually done when you do your consultant review.
Okay. Amy, is there a practice around this that, I mean, and I don't necessarily need to see a change in the policy itself, but also don't want to think that we're not being diligent with respect to, overseeing costs.
Yeah, certainly, the current practice that Brian just mentioned is one that is followed not only with fiduciary counsel, but your other consultants, investment consultants, me as your governance consultant, your compensation consultant. So very consistently practiced across the organization. From that perspective, since it is a staff philosophy, but it's also a delicate balance of the consultant being responsive to what the board feels it needs. And I think that's where the value of open and transparent communications comes in. And certainly, the quality that all of the consultants that you have has been good with that regard, and that they'll work with staff. And also detail is required just in your contracting and invoicing process, so that helps as a safeguard as well to monitor fees over time.
Okay. So something to keep in mind when the contracts are before us again in the future. Okay. Other questions, members? Okay, seeing none, this is an action item. Is there a motion? Okay, so moved by Ms. Hendricks, second by Mr. Rosenstiel, without objection. Okay, the revisions are adopted. Thank you. Thank you for the great work.
Thank you.
Okay. So we will now move on to, actually, if I could, maybe just take care of one other housekeeping item. If we could skip to item number 6, the draft agenda for the next committee meeting. I believe there's one change being suggested to the draft agenda as relates to item number 5.
Yes, and I have to apologize. There was some discussion about changing that language, and somewhere in the shuffle of getting it into the book, the old language was in there. So
Okay.
I think that's probably my fault.
No,
so.
that's fine. I'm glad we have it before us now. So, Brian, what are you suggesting the change to be?
We're really talking about board member accountability, and responsibilities.
Yeah.
As found in the policy manual. So that's really what we've been looking at.
All right. So, board member accountability and responsibilities. That's the only change on the agenda. Okay. All right. Questions, members, on the draft agenda? Okay. Hearing none.
We can change.
Is there a motion to adopt that? Okay. Motion by
Second.
Ms. Hendricks, second by Mr. Rosenstiel, without objection. Okay. The revised draft agenda is adopted. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to our board education item. And we're excited today to have a presentation by two experts from PwC, and I'll ask them to come forward, and Amy will do the formal introduction. But this is, I think, one of the main areas of focus of this committee is to continue to look at our board education program with respect to always seeking out best practices in a variety of areas that can help us be more effective as we look at policies and issues that arise in these areas. And today we will be focused on board oversight of information technology, which sometimes I think gets considered as an afterthought, but when we think about our business here is such an integral part of everything we do as an enterprise. So, Amy, if you wouldn't mind making the introduction.
It would be my pleasure to, Madam Chair. And seated next to me are Barbara Berlin and Terry Ward from the PwC Governance Insight Center. And it's a pleasure to have you here today. I've enjoyed our discussions so far, and I know that the committee will be eager to hear your insights and perspectives. I'll let Terry and Barbara talk to you a bit more about what the Governance Insight Center does, but at a high level, consider it as a clearinghouse of best practices, training, and development for corporate board members, corporate directors. Both Terry and Barbara have many years of experience in working on governance matters with corporate boards, and particularly in the area of information technology. And the Governance Insight Center produces a number of thought leadership papers and publications that are of great interest to board members. And there was a recent publication that they produced last year on oversight of IT that included a lot of research around how corporate boards spend their time reviewing information technology. What are the categories of information technology that they look at? What are the questions that, from their expertise and learnings, that they feel corporate directors should be asking? Terry, I understand, has experience with large-scale systems implementations, and so I know that he'll provide some insights to you this morning on that as well. But both of them are considered experts in their field. They both author a lot of thought leadership papers, and I really wanted this morning's focus to be on having them share the best practices of corporate boards. Again, knowing that there's never a one-to-one match between what is done in a corporate venue and what is done here in a very public venue. But there are key learnings that I think can be translated very easily. And hopefully you'll be hearing more about that this morning. So they have prepared remarks. They've provided a presentation for you, which is in your board materials packet. Their full biographies are also in your board materials packet, so I'd encourage you to look at that. And with that as a backdrop, I'll turn it over to you, Barbara and Terry. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you, Amy. That was a very nice introduction, and thank you to the committee for having this opportunity to speak with you. We sincerely hope that what we can provide here today is helpful to you, and I would probably start it out as saying also that any interruption is not being rude, that anytime that there's something that we say that you'd want to interject a question, please feel free to do so. We will pause a few times during our presentation, though, to allow you to maybe more formally ask questions. But anytime you want to ask, please do. I would probably start it out by saying, from an oversight of technology standpoint, we'll get into it, but it is something that all boards of all types are really facing at this point. And I would say maybe to also leverage off of what Amy said earlier in terms of this discussion. I wouldn't characterize this discussion as being a technical presentation from a technology standpoint. Certainly, Barbara and I have been exposed to that, but we wouldn't be experts in that area. We are certainly would consider that we're experts in the governance area, and so that's what this is about. This is about how you as committee members, board members, can oversee the technology area and try to simplify it to some extent, because it is a difficult area. So what we're trying to do here a little bit is what we see boards struggle with across the board is what's the right level of oversight. You can fly too high, if you will, and not have enough information to be able to really add value and to challenge the company or the organization in cases where you need to, or you can get into it too much and really be at a position where you're functioning as a member of management. And we see, again, members struggle with that in all different boards. So that's what we're hoping that we can help with, provide you with some questions, provide you with some examples, provide you with some leading practices to give you some ideas on how you can look at governing the oversight of technology. And again, I'll thank the CalSTRS management team for we had some preparation calls for this, so we were able to at least understand your situation a little bit better as we prepared for this. One thing, just Amy, you did a great job of providing some background on the Governance Insight Center. Barbara and I are both members of that Insight Center, as Amy indicated. I'll just add that, how do we do this? How do we get the information that we're, again, providing to you? We have meetings one-on-one with board members. We have meetings with groups of board members, as really what we're doing today. We do an annual director survey that gives us a lot of information on what boards are thinking, what leading practices are, and information technology in the IT area is one that we've been focusing on for a number of years in that area to get information from boards. And then we also do research and again, have thought leadership. And as Amy indicated, we do have a guide, the Directors and IT Guide, that is available on our website, I think has been provided to you also. And that's what we're really going to use as a guide for today. So today we want to be sharing leading practices and sharing those. I think the place to start, wrong button. The place to start is, I kind of said this before, is the area of IT is difficult to oversee. Very few board members in any organization have a deep knowledge and have CIO or Chief Information Technology experience or led an IT group. And so there is a gap that we see, and there's rapid change in this area. It's complicated. It can be intimidating. Not in the case here, but many boards have directors that they're pre-digital, I'll call them, the pre-digital era. And so the IT area is not second nature to them, and there's a lot of jargon, and so they just need help. But we also know that from our director survey that 65% of directors want to spend more time in this area. They know it's an area that's critical, and CEOs and heads of organizations know that technology is driving companies more and more these days. And so we're seeing boards get much more focused on it and really trying to find a way to navigate through this. So I guess with that, let's start and kind of talk about our Directors and IT Guide and really what we're going to go through today. And our Directors and IT Guide has a 6-step process basically that helps boards navigate the IT area. It's a bit of a structured approach. Hopefully will help effectiveness in terms of how you approach it. It really helps provide questions you can ask, which I think is one of the biggest benefits. And being able to ask the right questions, I think, is one of the, in a lot of different areas, especially in here when it's highly technical, that's one that I think arms you with the ability to add value and again, question or challenge management where it's appropriate. The other is this guide, we've made sure that it's holistic, and by that we mean that it takes into account new technologies, mobile computing, cloud computing, use of third parties, things like that. Things that are new, gives a framework to not just restrict that oversight to any specific area of IT, but the area of IT, as we all know, is taking different forms by day, and so this provides a means to be able to also look at those. And it's also flexible, flexible for profits, not-for-profits, governmental. So I think it's a guide that could really help you and give you benchmarks and ideas on how to oversee the area.
And let me just mention on that, Terry, I think that is the right setup about what this framework is about. Hopefully you all can hear me with this. And I think there really has been an evolution in the boardroom with discussions around technology where whether it's a public company, whether it's other companies, there's definitely more engagement by boards in all broader areas of technology. It used to be that the number one focus where a lot of this started was cybersecurity. But now we see where boards are getting engaged in other of the newer technologies and other technologies that the company is venturing into. So I think that's one. The other is, for a board, it's important to have a robust process in place when you're looking at different areas. And so this framework provides that process for the board to think about. And it's really not meant to be a panacea. It's not meant to be, follow step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's just a way to think about different areas of technology and get the board focused on the right topics within it.
Yeah, great. And the other thing that is maybe obvious is a lot of people, when they think of technology, they first think about cybersecurity and the risk related to it. But I think that if there's something that's trending that's different is that focus by boards, which was risk and cybersecurity, security risks and so on, is shifting to be what opportunities are these technologies providing for us? I mean, so it's really a strategic, more of a strategic tool, or thought of more of as a strategic tool than just pure risk, which probably was it was assigned to more in the past number of years. So with that, let's start getting into the steps that the Directors and IT Guide provides, and I will take the first one, and that's assessment. And by assessment, it really is what I think of as being kind of a lay of the land. I mean, what does your IT situation consist of? What is the health of your IT organization, and how important is IT to the organization? Again, getting back what I just indicated earlier is how important, if you look at the strategic objectives of your organization, what is the play of IT? And a lot of that will determine, where you take the rest of the steps. So this step here is kind of that foundational step. So a basic item that you'll hear a lot from a lot of different organizations are companies asking the question is, what are my crown jewels? What's the information that I have that I really need to protect for whatever reason? And for CalSTRS, that very well could be member information, beneficiary information, employee information, private information that really there needs to be a means to protect. For other companies, it could be formulas, it could be patents, it could be something related to a product. But every company in some way has kind of crown jewels and needs to have a way to be able to have a means to know that those are protected at least the best they can. So that's a first step in many companies' list in terms of assessing their IT area. Another is deferred maintenance. And by deferred maintenance, I mean, if you've got significant systems that are behind in their upgrades, leaving those systems vulnerable, there really should be some level of risk assessment related to those. And there are some very public cases of companies or organizations or even the government having situations where upgrades were not done timely and that vulnerability caused some issues. Another one that's more trending in this area is the IT budget. I would say that's probably not something I saw years ago, but I'm seeing now, which is board members asking the question from an IT budget standpoint and from the head of IT, are there things in that budget that are holding you back from enhancing the system or protecting the system to keep the health of the system at a stage that the organization is comfortable with? And some of the questions I've seen there are things like, what if you had another dollar to spend or X number of dollars to spend, what would you spend those on and why? And so that sometimes you can flesh out a bit of whether the organization is behind or is in a safe spot in terms of maintenance and from a budget standpoint. The other one that, again, I would call emerging, not in just the area of IT, but certainly in the area of IT, and that is IT outsourcing. And I would probably broaden that by more saying using third parties. Using third parties to conduct your business, many of which allow third parties access to your system. Many of those allow or provide for third parties to be part of your IT health in some way, provide access and some level of risk assessment related to those third parties and what their level of access is and what their level of controls, if you will, are something that certainly that we're seeing companies and boards focus more and more on. So one thing I didn't yet mention is in our guide in the back, there's a number of questions in each of these step areas, a number of questions to ask. So we've provided those to you. What I've done is kind of just walk through some of those that I think maybe are maybe the highlight questions, at least in the assessment area.
And I think it's important to note that those questions are really guides. I mean, they're certainly not meant to be a checklist for the board to use, but a means to sort of jog some discussion with various members of management or amongst the board yourself. So they are high level intentionally, because from a board perspective, you want to be at that oversight level. But they shouldn't be taken as sort of a checklist that these are the 6 questions we need to ask for each of these areas. So then if we move on and we look at the second consideration within the framework, it's really about the approach. And when we're focused on this step, it's really about what is your board's approach to technology. And it focuses on things like, who's going to own the various areas of technology and whether those individuals have the skill sets. And then if not, how do you go about dealing with that? So when we first talk about ownership, one of the items is it the board's responsibility or is it one of the committee's responsibilities of the board to oversee certain areas of technology? And so as we started, cybersecurity, of course, becomes a big topic that many boards are focused on. And oftentimes that responsibility seems to sit with the audit committee. Now, it's interesting, as Terry stated, we do an annual corporate director survey. And in that survey, we get over 800 directors responding. And in that response to the question of where do IT risks sit, which often is focused on from cybersecurity, 54% of them said that it sits with the audit committee, where only 25% said that it sits at the board level. And if you look at sort of the data over, we asked the question a couple of times, once in 2012, once in 2015, and then follow that up with our new information as we meet with boards and audit committees, you do sort of see the trend line going where cybersecurity has now taken a bigger role at the board level versus the audit committee level. So you've seen some movement and trend in that. Then that number was probably higher for audit committees when you looked at it in 2012. Now, what we often get asked about when it comes to ownership is what about a risk committee or what about a technology committee? Are those good governance committees that can be used to oversee different areas of technology? And really for risk committees, in the public marketplace, it's mostly financial services companies that have risk committees. About 10% of all public companies have a risk committee. And again, as I said, mostly in financial services as mandated. So my point of bringing that up is it really hasn't been a big adoption beyond the financial services sector for boards to develop risk committees to take on these additional areas or even broader risks of the organization. Another one that we often get asked by boards is technology committees. Should the board have a technology committee? And there's even fewer technology committees that exist in the public marketplace if you use that as a point of reference. Only about 5% of public companies have a technology committee. And interestingly, even one board that we spoke with who did establish one, what they found is they put the technology expert on the technology committee, and they really felt like the board wasn't getting the full education, that they actually dismantled that committee. So I think, there's no silver bullet. I know CalSTRS is structured differently from a standpoint that you have a governance committee that's overseeing the system implementation, you have an audit and risk committee, you have an investment committee. But the point of the approach is for the board to consider where different areas of technology will be overseen, make certain that there's agreement so that things don't fall through the cracks or people don't think that other people are paying attention to those areas, whether it's cyber, whether it's a system implementation, whether it's a new technology.
I think we have a question, Barbara. On that.
Sure.
Harry?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a question on, if I heard you correctly, 5% of companies have technology committees? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So is it a higher percentage in specific industries? For example, in the finance industry, for example, would you see a higher number? And in technology-driven companies that are solely 100% dependent on technology, is that number higher? And looking forward, living in a technological age, do you think that number is going to rise?
That's a very good question. To respond, typically we don't see it in the financial industry. When you look at that 5% of companies, I think because they look more to the risk committee and their board. But the companies that do have technology committees are those that are heavily invested in technology, the computer chip makers, those companies, as well as science and technology companies, the bioscience. Those seem to be where they develop and have those committees.
And maybe to add to that also, I in the past year did a bit of a study on, these are S&P 500 companies, but S&P 500 companies in terms of board composition. And part of that was focused on the number of committees and the nature of committees by industry that are out there. And what we found is really consistent with what Barbara just indicated, which is that I don't think from a technology committee standpoint or a risk committee standpoint, again, taking out those that are required to have risk committees, it's a very small percentage, and I didn't see much of a difference by industry of those that had technology committees. I mean, they were pretty rare. They're pretty rare even across industries. So, and I would maybe add to that, this is more based on taking a step back and looking at that population by industry, is that I think the trend, if we're seeing anything, it's that certain things are making their way up to the board level, because they're so important that boards, and cybersecurity is probably a very good example that I hear over and over, that they believe that that's a board level issue, not a committee level issue. And so that's why some of those really important areas to a organization find their way to the board. And so therefore those committees just don't last long.
Madam Chair, one follow-up question, please. I've heard quite a bit of discussion around skill sets that individual board members, it's ideal to have the diversity of skill sets within the individuals on boards and then placing them in the correct committees. So my question to you is, do you, not so much as committee, but someone on the board that has expertise and deep background in technology? I've heard a lot of discussion around cyber issues especially, that it's critically important on a forward-looking basis that boards think about having someone on their board that has that type of rich background in technology, in a, looking forward, that's just going to be something that you really want to have on your board. Have you seen that as something that is a practice we should be thinking about?
That is probably one of the big topics that are out there. In fact, probably Terry and I would both say in our current year of governance and starting last year, board composition has become the #1 topic in public boardrooms. And the discussion is making certain that you have a board fit for the future. You have a board that helps it really deliver on the strategy of the organization. And particularly for public companies, there are investors who are taking a very close look at that. But that is actually your question on skill sets is the second part of this approach. How do you address skill sets? And the question comes up with, do you bring somebody on your board that has that deep technology skill set, or do you fill that seat with another individual? And I have to tell you, there is a debate of whether that seat should be given up to somebody who has technological experience. And the reason being, some companies, it's critical that you need it, depending on the company. And you've seen where some financial services firms have brought on somebody with deep technological or even cybersecurity experience. But what we hear on that debate is that board members really want to fill that seat with somebody who has even broader experience, not just somebody who has deep technology, because the concern is, in a few years, will that individual's technology experience not be relevant? How would they keep up? And then also, I would add to that, for those companies that have added it, there is a limited pool of candidates that, one, are board ready and have that technological experience. And it kind of ties to some of the points that Terry brought up, earlier in that IT confidence gap. There's not a lot of board members who have that skill set. So really what you see is more people looking to external advisors to bring that skill set into the boardroom. So we asked out even that question in our annual corporate director survey of, how many external advisors is the board engaging with an external advisor related to technology? And in 2012, that number was 27%. In 2015, that number, I think in between, it went to 35 or something, and it went to 54% in 2015. So there's been a tremendous movement in that regard to help the board get those skills and get the knowledge to perform its oversight role by reaching out to external advisors.
Appreciate that, and I don't want to derail the conversation, but I would like to just put it out there for our chair of the board and the chair of the governance committee and us collectively working with Ms. McDuffie, this is something we, future thinking around our skill sets. Currently, I think we're functioning quite well, but over the next 18 months, I think as we're looking forward, that's an issue we perhaps want to start talking about at an offsite, in terms of the future needs as we're looking at transition over an 18-month period. So I just put it out there for us.
Thank you.
Thank
Harry.
you.
Thank you. Dana?
Here.
And I will just add, a couple more small comments on that from, most boards are looking for somebody who has a CEO background or a retired CEO as their number one skill set, somebody who's seen the broad picture of the company. That seems to be the background that's number one on their list. But of the directors that we did ask in our annual corporate director survey, 40% of them did say that they wanted somebody with IT expertise. So you can see a split where different boards have taken different approaches to address the skills gap.
But I would just add that that is a very good question and one that we get very often in terms of how companies have addressed this issue. So it's a very timely question.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Dana, followed by Paul.
So kind of to build on that, I know for our board, things have gotten a lot more complicated. We're having to learn a lot more about a lot of different topics that say 10, 15 years ago, we didn't even have to have. So I know that we're starting to spend more time on education. It's more time just to review our materials and things like that. So I guess along with the board composition and structure, what are you seeing by way of what type of time these board members are having to expend? Are they expending more time doing their jobs now than they have in the past? Are you seeing anything like that? And while I know you mostly work with corporate boards, I'm sure that you're aware of issues around public boards also. And could you kind of compare or contrast some of that, if you could, please?
I can start, and I would say, specific to IT, that, again, I indicated in our annual corporate director survey, we do try to get into what's going on out there in boards as well as our discussions, but clearly boards are spending more time on IT. There's really no doubt about that. Our director survey clearly indicates that. And not only that is we ask questions about where do they want to spend more time, various topics, not just IT, various topics. And IT is always, and cybersecurity especially is in the top few. So it's certainly an area that despite spending more, they want to spend even more time. So I think then maybe broadening it to workload. And that's where the topic of board composition really starts to be forefront. And by board composition, it's not always just the people you have on the board and the people you have on the committee. It's a bit of allocation of who's doing what. And for instance is, my background is more related to audit committees and so on. So audit committees, historically, it's just a good example, is that audit committees have been the owners of risk in a lot of companies. That's where the risk assessment has resided for a long time, but that because of the other pressures and in that world, their workload became too much. And cybersecurity, in a lot of cases, was a tipping point where they said, we can't take on cybersecurity. Number one, we don't maybe have the right people, but we also don't have the time, and so that needs to be a board level item. So I think what's happening is there is more time being spent in this area. Much of it is finding its way to the board itself versus committees, or new committees are being established in certain cases, even though fairly rare, meaning a risk committee, technology committee. So that's the only other thing I will add is I know there's statistics out there in terms of how much corporate boards spend. It's not part of our survey. And I believe that's gone up, but maybe not as much as I would expect in terms of their statistics, in terms of board, how much a board member spends annually. I believe that number is around 250 hours a year.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Terry, we do benchmarks as well and look at the number of board meetings that companies are doing. We look at those even by National Association of Corporate Directors. And overall, I would not say the number of meetings have changed significantly year over year. I think we do hear often the workload has increased, but there's also been a focus within the boards and the committees to really increase the effectiveness of the meetings. And so we've seen where Boards now have gone from, rather than just having an executive session at the end of the day, the closed-door private sessions with individuals, they will have them first thing in the morning. And the reason they do that is to make certain that everybody has done the pre-reading and to get everybody on the same page to understand what the key issues are that the board is really going to focus in on those discussions. And we actually even had an activist investor that we spoke with that was working with or part of one of the boards, and he said, I'm surprised that corporate boards don't have more executive sessions throughout the day. Now, I know your structure is a little bit different, but we really see the looking at the meetings and also looking at the information that's provided to the board, looking at ways to make a more of an executive summary and help the board get through those, as well as changing to not have as many presentations but more discussion. I mean, I think it was pretty common before that when we would meet with boards, they would allocate 1 hour. I'd say that is not always the norm now. Sometimes a lot of those discussion topics are happening in 20 minutes and 30 minutes. And so I think everybody's looking for a way to sort of deal with more workload.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I want to get to all the questions, but I think this next section on prioritization will be actually quite instructive too. Paul?
Thank you. This is very interesting. Every time you talk about how boards are trying to identify board members with various skills, of course, that doesn't apply to us, unfortunately. This board doesn't choose new board members. So, we have a very skilled group of board members, but people external from us are making the decisions about who's on this board. And therefore, if we identify a certain need, that doesn't mean we're going to be able to address it. So given that, does that mean that the concept of using an outside advisor becomes even more important, or does that change the dynamics that we should be having with staff about this? So, and you don't need to answer this right now, maybe just, kind of in the back of your mind, weave that into the rest of the presentation, because every time I hear you say, and the board thinks that they are going to put somebody with this skill set in this seat, I kind of say, well, that's great, but that's not a solution for us. So.
No, and I think that's actually, I meant to bring that up as we got into some of these questions. We do know you're structured differently at CalSTRS. But I will say on the flip side of that, one of the points that we hear most common in the boardroom is having diversity of perspective, diversity of thought, in addition to diversity of gender, racial diversity, and that is a major focus of boards today. So when I've spoken to directors and I ask them what makes a board great, they say diversity of thought in the boardroom, different people who can bring different perspectives to an issue. So from that perspective, that's very positive for CalSTRS because
Absolutely,
you have
but
the
it doesn't
diversity.
necessarily help us figure. I mean, I think this board has struggled with the question of what to do about oversight of IT and cybersecurity, and in so many other areas where we don't have expertise, we have consultants. We have Amy as a consultant to this committee. So I mean, and Harry raised that. I think it's a really legitimate question for us to consider as to whether we need outside assistance on a consistent basis. So I'm kind of tuned into that as much as anything as I'm listening to you.
And maybe if I could add that, again, your board structure and maybe what you can do as a board, I'm not as familiar with, but I will say that I definitely understand your question. And even those boards that do have the ability, which most do have the ability to determine their board composition and change their board composition to get the right diversity, and diversity defined in a lot of different ways, but also the right skill sets. Many of them, especially in the IT area, at the end of the day, still find that they don't have the expertise because it is difficult to find. It is difficult to find the right expertise to tackle some of the issues that find their way into the IT technology area. So I think the way that we're seeing boards deal with that is education, meaning the existing board members that are there to educate them as much as possible, and that we do that, this type of thing, from an IT perspective, from a governance perspective, but also from bringing in technical people that can try to at least bring a more technical discussion to the matters, and that's IT as well as, in my area of accounting, we have the same issue there. But the other is that we clearly, and Barbara indicated this earlier, we're clearly seeing a trend that corporate boards are, at the end of the day, saying, we don't have the level of expertise, we need to bring a third-party consultant to help us as a board, not separate from management, but hire that consultant to help us think through and help us ask the right questions or dive into the right areas. So those at least has been the formula, if you will, that we've seen from a corporate board standpoint.
So actually, to piggyback on that, because I was thinking about how difficult it would be to have an expert on every issue that each of the corporations or public institutions deal with. On each of the boards, you would have 50 board members on each board to be able to have real expertise. And so it seems to me that what your institution does, like Governance Institute, and what we're trying to learn here is how to ask the right questions. And I think when I started serving on the community college board, I'm not an expert on higher education, but what I was taught was you have to learn how to ask the right questions. And I think the education piece that we're receiving here, and maybe those tools or what the right questions are to ask, I think are much more fruitful than just having experts on boards, because sometimes that expertise can really kind of blind you to some of the things that you would ask because you're not an expert. And so I think there's a really interesting balance there of ensuring that people who are on boards are thoughtful and critical thinkers, and they have those skills that you need to be able to ask the right questions. And having this education, I think, is a piece of it. So I would say that I think we want to be very careful about thinking about we have to have experts on everything on each of these committees and boards, but instead is how do we make sure we have frameworks or systems in place so that we're asking the right questions to ensure that we're doing our due diligence in every one of these pieces.